The most powerful line in Andrea Scott's Controlled Damage is, "I didn't do anything wrong." This speaks to the larger scope which the play tackles. Viola Desmond, a woman known to us now because of her act of bravery and defiance, was one of thousands of Canadians in our nation's past who was affected by its systemic racism, marginalization, misogyny, and colonial patriarchy. It is essential that we tell these stories of our past. I continue to tell these stories because, as a country, I feel we are woefully negligent of learning from them. Canada, Nova Scotia, Halifax has a rich and beautiful history that should be celebrated. Yet, it is essential that while we celebrate the wonderful aspects of our history, that we also voice and recognize the contradictions within it. We cannot look away from the horrors of Canadian history, the mistreatment of First Nations and other ethnic groups, and the fact that Canada was, and still is in many ways, a country steeped in and practices ideals based on colonial patriarchy. We tell these stories to remind ourselves of our past wrongs in order to learn from them and become better citizens, better humans, better neighbors. Andrea Scott has constructed a beautiful play, Grecian in its theatricality and scope. She has given us a chorus that not only guides us through and participates in the telling of the story, but true to the Grecian model, the chorus represents all of us. We have a responsibility to tell and listen to these stories. This company of artists have courageously dived into this responsibility, and I am in awe of them. It takes courage to stand up to or sit down in defiance, to say no more, to demand to be heard, to urge others to listen, to tell stories, and to know deep in one's heart that I didn't do anything wrong. This is Controlled Damage.
How does that make people feel?
Powerful. Yeah.
In what ways?
Strong. It's the continuation of a strong person who stood their ground. And now here's a writer today taking that story and adding power to it by bringing it to the world and explaining not just the story, but why it matters.
Right. Yeah. Quentrel, how do you feel?
It's power, you know what I mean? And it's inspiring that, a story that was decades ago, you're bringing it to the forefront now to empower and inspire more people.
Mm-hmm. Nzingha.
I just think that the power of theater itself is helping us to relive moments. And that's really what this is. It's for those of us who were not there in the Roseland Theater, what was that atmosphere like, essentially, is what I'm really excited to see happen and come out on stage. And I'm really interested in how the director uses that Grecian model to kind of play up the values of democracy and speaking out, which we're spoken about. Just the fact that this is an ongoing discourse, a political discourse, and it's being illuminated through art is something that we have to keep continuing, that type of way of speaking out.
Using art to tell stories.
Yes, absolutely.
It's one of the more powerful ways to tell stories, whether directly through film, but I think there's an added, and I don't know what it is, but there's this cool layer of storytelling through theater that's different. And maybe it's the human interaction with the actors and that kind of tight experience and kind of being with those who are creating the art. So I think there's a real cool beauty in this play and a really cool way in which theater will tell this powerful story that some of us know, some of us aren't necessarily familiar with, but it's a story that's impactful and it's important, and more people do, in fact, need to know about it and about Viola Desmond. So we are here today to do that. My name is Terrence Taylor. I am joined by Nzingha Millar, Quentrel Provo, and Juanita Peters to discuss Controlled Damage, play put on by Neptune Theater. Is everyone here familiar with the story?
Absolutely.
Okay, so Quentrel, tell me the story of Viola Desmond.
So basically, her car broke down. And so while her car was getting fixed, she decided to go check out a movie at the Roseland Theater. And basically, it costs more to sit on the main floor, is what I've learned.
Right.
I didn't know that at the time. And then when I read a story, she wanted to pay the extra to sit on the main floor. But they told her no. She went in, basically sat there, and then manager came in, called the police. They removed her because she wouldn't move. Basically took her to jail, went to court. They tried her. Basically the tax evasion.
Yes.
Tax evasion
because of the cost difference between the two tickets.
Yes.
1 cent.
1 cent. And she sat in jail with her white gloves on and everything, and she really didn't do anything. And that was the craziest thing, that she wanted to pay extra.
Yeah.
To sit down there, and they wouldn't allow that just because of the color of her skin.
And the other big part of this story is that Viola Desmond was a businesswoman, a very prominent businesswoman.
Yeah.
So now charging somebody with tax evasion, what does that do to your business?
100%, yeah.
Right? So here's a woman who owns her own beauty school. She owns her own line of beauty products in the 1940s.
Yeah.
She drives a fabulous car, right? Yeah. Which was quite unusual for Black people in general, let alone a woman.
Yeah.
The other piece of this that I don't think people quite recognize is the fact that people didn't talk about it. We think people did because it was in the papers and because it was a court case. The NAACP came to Nova Scotia, all that. But it was considered inappropriate, of course, to go to jail. So it's not a story that was passed down in the family in detail. It wasn't talked about at the dinner table. Right? And we're celebrating it today, and we're talking a lot about it today in recognition of the hundreds of thousands of Nova Scotians who had gone through something very similar. But at the time, I'm sure that Viola Desmond died without that satisfaction of understanding that people respected her for the stand that she took. And I always find that very unfortunate. And I always say, tell that person who is doing good today.
That's a
give them their flowers.
Give them their flowers now. Quentrel, your flowers. That's for you. The road is long, and it becomes very lonely if people put you on the other side of the fence.
Why do you think it is that people wait to give people the praise that they deserve for doing this type of, having this courageous moment?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons why. Number one, sometimes people don't look at it as being courageous at the time because everybody was going through it. Then you have to layer on the fear. If I speak up and recognize you and say you did we are a completely different generation today. At that time, people had power over you. And so I don't want to lose my job, right? I can, if that were my great-grandparents or grandparents, that would have been their fear. Their bread and butter was coming from people who didn't look like them.
Right.
And so you didn't want to stand out. You didn't want people targeting your family. You didn't want your circumstances to change if they were okay or better than most. Yeah. There's all kinds of reasons. But I think mostly people were afraid.
I just really want to go back to this statement of I did nothing wrong, because that to me is what resounds when I think of the Viola Desmond story.
Break it down.
This is something that is still happening today, where we can't find a reason for culpability for a Black person that we don't want in our space. And so we have to find reason to remove them. And in Viola's case, where she honestly asked and pleaded to pay what was worth to sit in that seat, and he refused, And then what happened after that was really about finding something to pin on her, basically, right? So we're going to use this sales tax, but really it's because we want to keep our theater segregated. It was not on the books, but it was customary for Blacks to sit in the upper level and for whites to get a better seat in the lower level. And so they're not laws, but customs that we see going on today, which we'll get into, that still separate us and don't allow the mobility for Black people in our society, the mobility for a woman to, shop with her kids in Walmart. And this is what we really have to keep talking about.
For a man to drive a nice car.
Right.
When we talk about breaking it down, we have to think about all the people who were involved in this, all the hands that it had to go through in order for her to wind up in the courts.
Right.
So there's the ticket agent who could have changed that story. There's the person taking the ticket that could have changed that story. There's the security people who could have changed that story.
Right.
There's the owner that could have changed that story. And now the courts. That's a lot of people.
Right.
The point that her car broke down, I always find that's an important detail.
Why is that?
I think it's important because it just shows you how, in a moment of fate, as a Black woman living here in Nova Scotia, your life can be changed forever in that you are unsafe. I'm thinking I'm fine leaving my house at maybe after dark, and I have my mother worrying about me, praying for me.
Right.
And it's just in the fact that something so simple as having your car break down, being in the wrong place at the wrong time where someone else has the power to say that you don't belong there could end up changing your life forever. And only because you are asserting the fact that you've done nothing wrong. And that is, to me, just what blows my mind.
And she was a Black woman. It's hard enough being a Black man, but it's when you're a woman and you're Black.
So to you as a man, because we also have two Black women at the table. So to you as a man, what is that? How is that experience different?
Women in general are just still fighting to be equal. And then you're Black at the same time. So you're also fighting for that. So they got two things against them. I'm only a young Black man. So because I'm Black, if I was a young Black, a young white guy, it's different. But they're a woman and they're Black. So especially at that time, we look at it like her car broke down and everything, and fate had it. It was two white men that dragged her out. And I always thought to myself when hearing her story, I was like, where were the Black men in the theater?
Scared.
And I was like, where was the Black? There had to be Black men at the theater at that time.
Right.
That seen, this Black woman being dragged up by two white officers. And I've never heard anyone say that they said a word or they tried to, stop what was happening.
Oddly enough with this story, there was a man in Halifax who was a little boy in the theater that day. He was in the theater that day when this happened. He actually ran the tattoo. He's retired now. He's an older man. He's retired. And he told his story of being in the theater that day, but of course not knowing what really happened because it was just never talked about again. Yeah. In his world.
Yeah.
In our society, Black men and white women have the ability to be either oppressed or oppressor. And I thought that was so interesting because it then shows us, even within that race and gender complex, how sensitive that is. And to me, it brings up thoughts of the conversations that we've been having on, for instance, street checks and things that are very, very important going on right now in Halifax, that we have to be careful of the language even that we're using and whose stories are we prioritizing in dealing with that issue. Are we talking about Black women also dealing with street checks, not just Black males?
Exactly.
And the fact that they are doubly oppressed, and that if I'm a Black woman driving a nice car, like Viola Desmond most likely was, that I might be assumed to be what? Like, this is my pimp's car? Like, whose car is it? Yeah. Am I, I'm being questioned as to why is the name on the car, it's registered in my dad's name, Dr. So-and-so. And so, just the fact that it can't occur to someone that I could have secured this prosperity for myself. You know, that's the issue.
Do you think there was any benefit to her being a Black woman in this story? And maybe not so much in the moment, but over time, when we look back at this, what makes this more impactful and more memorable and more important because she was both a Black woman?
The story becomes a bigger story and a more relatable story to people because you would assume somebody of her status would not go through this. You would assume that here's a woman who's made it.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So if she has all that she has, and she is that intelligent, which she was,
Right.
and smart, what about little old me? What chance do I have?
Right.
I think that was one of the pieces of the story, I think, that really caught the attention of African Nova Scotians and most recently, all Canadians. So here was a woman who seemed to have everything, and yet look what the justice system in Nova Scotia did to her.
Right.
When we look at this story from the lens of this happening to a Black woman, conventionally we think that women should be protected in our society, but which women, which is what we've been saying, Black women aren't afforded that same protection. Not only are our bodies and our being in a space is seen as threatening, but it's also the flip side of that, where either we are lusted after, or then the next side of that, which is the fact that we don't get those same protections, traditional protections of womanhood, which is, you know, you're weak, you need to be protected. And maybe that really does beg the question, do we know if any Black men were there and stood up for her or not? And did they think it's their place? And because they are, you know, also fearing being oppressed in that moment, that they were not protective in that moment in the way that we traditionally see fit, especially at that time, which was in the 1940s.
Yes.
Yeah.
It wouldn't have had the same effect if it was a man, Black man.
Why is that?
To me, you know, especially in the Black community, think of my grandmother, my great grandmother, those women were strong women. And for her, like the generation that she came up in and the time that she sat, in the Black community, the mama of the house was the strong woman, you know, and to see that,
right,
and to put that in perspective, and it was the perfect person for that. Like a Black woman was the perfect thing for that story. Like if it was a Black man, like, you know, we've seen that, you know, type of stuff happen,
right? But
for a woman, you know, and a Black woman at that, to take a stand and do it the way she did. To me, it was just empowerment in itself, because I'm used to that, you know. My grandmother, you know, granddaddy's like, you know, a strong man, but, you know, when Nanny says something, everybody listens.
Right.
You know what I mean? So in the Black community, we knew that the Black women were strong. So for her to take that stand on a public stage, it just made that story more powerful. I don't think it would have been as powerful if it was a Black man at the time.
I think a detail of the story that I read as well is that when she was with her husband at the end of all of this, she brought this issue to him, and he was of the mindset of just let it rest, pray about it. Don't push, don't be too seen. Probably thinking of some of those things that you mentioned, Juanita, which is we have a public image in this community. People respect us. We don't want to be seen as troublemakers, right?
Right.
And so to me, her fearlessness in saying, no, I know I did nothing wrong. I'm fighting this. And then in that time, influencing her husband to go and make decisions. He's the one who approached the lawyer. Of course, that is to be seen as, you know, the man needed to approach a lawyer to have that relationship and respect and to seek some advice on what to do. In that time, she wouldn't have had representation, you know, without some of the supports that did rally around her, but still not enough to influence the law. The fact that she stood and knowing that all of those cards were stacked against her as a Black woman and going through having to navigate this through her husband is really amazing.
Yeah, because when I looked at the story, she had to influence like her husband and other males in the community, just, you know, that I'm not going to let this go.
Right.
And even though they found her guilty of tax evasion, she still didn't let it go. She still pressed on, you know, through everything. But that says a lot, that she had to influence the, you know, Black males around her, because they wanted her to let it go. They were like, you know, just let it go. And maybe that played a role in why no Black man stopped the thing that happened at the theater. You know, they knew, they knew the rules that were set in place and they didn't want to break them. But to her, it didn't matter. I was fearless, you know, and that's why it's so powerful.
Bringing it back to Juanita's point that you made earlier about Viola being an entrepreneur, and Quentrel, you're talking about the strength of Black women. The fact that she started a hair school and created her own products, one of the key components of the hair school was that mentorship and being able to provide supports and education and a community for Black women who at this time, because of segregation, couldn't go to beauty school, traditional beauty school. So can we talk a little bit about the importance, the impact of creating communities within our communities and how that can help take us to a level that, you know, there's things that we can probably all say this is important, but there's going to be that small group of people that say, okay, well, let's make something happen and let's create change. So what does that look like in terms of these micro communities within the communities that are pushing things forward?
Well, you just said it. She was a game changer. She was. If you are a Black woman in the 40s and you're looking at, you know, there are the magazines on the shelves that tell you what beauty looks like.
Right.
Now, you can't walk into the drugstore and buy makeup
No way.
that goes on my face, right? So she created it, you know, to answer to the needs of African Nova Scotians, or I don't know if she shipped her stuff beyond Nova Scotia or not, but she certainly took care of African Nova Scotian women.
Right.
And it was that whatever we need, I will bring it. What you need, I will make it. That mindset, I don't think was an average mindset at the time.
Right.
You know, you get used to taking the scraps and the things that are on the shelf and the things that are just put out there and you make do.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But she was able to be a game changer and show African Nova Scotians that their needs could get met as well. And that they had it in themselves to make that happen. And so the beauty school was not just a beauty school teaching you how to do ethnic hair, but it was teaching you all those other values as well.
What you just spoke about is the power of entrepreneurship and standing in the gap of where something is needed. But how important that is when you are shoved to the side is so much more important, that you are essentially creating that space through her beauty school and graduating upwards of 15 students every year. She then empowered those women to go and either start their own businesses. So like make
trickle down.
To have shops. She would push out her product. Like as far as Quebec, I think I read even the fact that having a salon was a safe space for Black women, you know, even to get away from home and talk and everything. Talk about issues. And like, I'm sure so many things got solved in that beauty shop talk where you just have that sisterhood and creating those spaces was a part of a segregated world, which some would argue was actually good for us and necessary.
Yep. Yeah.
And the fact that now, you know, there's less people that are owning their own businesses from the Black community, and, you know, we're running up against competition in a wider market, you know, we have less of those spaces to go to. So that to me is an important factor in all this as well.
Because you spent some time, Nzingha, at the African Nova Scotian Youth Employment Lab, which is where we work together in terms of what does entrepreneurship look like? How do we develop entrepreneurs? How do we develop businesses? And how do we create our own ecosystem so that we can be self-sustainable? So I'm curious, personally, like what her story, how her story has impacted you to be in a room like that and say, you know what, I want to be one of those people within the community that's making change.
Well, it's people like her that have opened the doors for us to have these conversations, that we're essentially saying, why can't Black youth start businesses? We had Viola Desmond in the 1940s, right? So, you know, we got to make this happen. What can we do to support people that have ideas to make money, increase our wealth as a community? I am inspired, one, by the fact that beauty as a business, we have some, as a Black female, we have a lot of interesting relationships to that. So let's say, you know,
with the beauty industry,
right? And that when we look back, there were products that were meant to empower us and products that were meant to have us assimilate, basically, you know, to look more palatable to the white beauty standard. And I know that, you know, in that time, people were of that mindset, but I think it fundamentally was coming from a place of saying, I'm worthy of feeling beautiful, of having something that's mine. And I think that her entrepreneurship and going in that direction of the beauty industry is very, very much inspiring to me.
Quentrel, you're a business person. You've started a business, Stop the Violence. So how's Viola's story impacted your ability to find means to be self-sustainable from a business perspective, but also stopping the violence and working towards decreasing crime in the community and bringing people together, essentially?
You have to care enough and be passionate enough to want to make a difference, and be all about what you're doing. When you get so caught up in the things, I remember when I first started Stop the Violence, a lot of people were questioning, you know, how are you going to do this? You know, no one's done this, you know, how are you going to sustain this? And I remember after the first march, and it was basically me doing it out of my way of grieving. And I just put my whole self in it. And, you know, I didn't know the violence here was that bad and everything. But once you get into it and you start sitting in on court cases and you start talking to families and you start hearing details and you're like, this is something with a cold case. And it's here in Nova Scotia, but I wouldn't have never knew had I not got into doing Stop the Violence. And
100%.
I've been able to, you know, sustain everything, and going back to Martin Luther King and Viola Desmond, particularly, she did beauty, and, you know, she was so passionate and caring about, you know, beautifying, you know, Black women. You know how you feel when you get your hair did and everything, you know how much that makes you feel. And so she cared that much to do, you know, whatever she could so that we could have something to call our own.
Right.
And so I took that same method in doing Stop the Violence and being able to care and being able to be passionate and being genuine. And this is a real issue. And it doesn't take money. It just takes you having a mindset that you want to make change. You want to make a difference. And I tell kids, if you believe in something and if you believe that you can make change, nothing's going to stop you. I said, you're going to have obstacles along the way. I've had a lot of obstacles, a lot of stress, a lot of times of giving up. And, you know, people close to me know these things.
Right.
But the thing that keeps me going is that I care so much and I'm so passionate. I've felt that hurt of losing someone close to violence. So when you feel those type of things and you go through those type of situations where you've lost loved ones to violence, it's different. It hits me different. Like, I don't have to know the victims that have been killed, but it hits me the same.
Right.
And a lot of people don't understand that. And I'm like, because this is something I care so much about.
Yeah, you're at the grassroots level, on the ground with the people. And so therefore you're not up here making decisions for people and trying to advise people from a place that you have no idea.
You never really, like, I've never really gotten over the loss of Caitlin. You know, the thing what I just learned, you just learn to deal. Every day is a new day. Take it as it comes. You don't ever get over the loss of someone. You just learn how to deal with life as it comes. Right. Viola Desmond, she also taught me resilience. Resiliency, you know, how she never gave up when the men were telling her, you know, just let it go. No, she didn't want to let it go. She wanted, you know, to make a difference. And look at that difference. That was the 1940s. Here we are, you know, in 2020. And that difference is still having an effect today.
Right.
And that's the crazy thing about it. You know what I mean? I started to Stop the Violence and after, you know, I'm dead and gone, I want someone else to have that same motivation, some kid, you know, to come up and have that same drive to make a difference going, you know, their path. You know, it doesn't matter if you're going to stop the violence. It doesn't matter what you're doing, but have that same drive and that same resiliency to make a difference.
I like that. I like that.